Good morning and welcome to Securing the Stars, Safeguarding Space Systems with Chat. So if you haven't met Chat, he possesses over 20 years of experience in offensive cybersecurity, establishing himself as a highly technical cybersecurity practitioner. He holds certifications as a CREST Certified Simulated Attack Manager, a CREST Certified Tester, and serves as an examination assessor for CREST Australasia. He has delivered complex technical cybersecurity assessment programs and incident response engagements for numerous high-profile Australian and global organisations. He is a fellow ASA and CREST member, of ASA and CREST. He is also presently engaged in the pursuit of a doctoral degree in cybersecurity and space intelligence. So can everyone please give me a warm welcome? Thank you so much, Chat. And just a reminder, if you do have any questions, can you please pop it in the app?
Sounds good. Thank you for the warm introduction. And as you said, I'm a fella. So go from there. Oh, it was already there. So, I highly recommend you to scan random QR codes on the screen. So go from there. So, my background is offensive side of cyber and intelligence. And what I'm going to talk to you today is pretty much something I started as aspiration, so end up in a PhD. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But let's get into the points today. Oops. So why space matter? So I think this is purely coincidental. So yesterday, Kylie did a brilliant talk covering fifth frontier, right? So this is the final frontier, space. So there's a natural link between that talk, first part of that talk and this one. So here we're going to discuss more around why it's matter, why the security in space kind of matter, and what's happening in around the world, and what we could do to keep the final frontier safe from adversaries. So space is a invisible backbone. Currently, communications, navigations, defense, energy, you name it, right? So every single sector has some sort of a dependency in there. So in Australia, space recognized as a critical infrastructure. However, in a number of other countries, so space not necessarily recognized as a critical infrastructure. So something to think about. What's the reliance on finance in space? Anyone? Any takers? Like how come like a banking transaction rely on space? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one, right? So communication mechanism. However, what we also don't see is NTP, right? So NTP rely on satellite communications like GNSS, global positioning networks, so which provide you the accurate timing for transactions like shift networks and things like that. A lot of things can go wrong if someone managed to, have funny things with those satellites. Right. So there's this phase. If satellites goes down, the grid follows. When satellite goes down, the grid doesn't gonna blast and things like that. But it's a saying, so I have a disclaimer saying, while grid can function without any problems, there are going to be significant efficiency loss. The issue here is that, in modern days, you have a lot of remote sensing going on with different, like a smaller solar power stations, wind power stations, and other power sources, right? So they control a lot of communications, sensing via satellites. So the whole idea is that when that system goes down, as you said, the communication goes down, sensing goes down, a lot of downlinks going to go down, and it create problems, right? So the whole idea is there's an opportunity for someone to have a fire sale on just taking out satellites, right? And throughout this talk, we'll understand, and we're going to go through that. It's not necessarily a super hard thing to do as well, right? Satellite is pretty much a computer on the sky. That's it. And, if you're following geopolitics for the last 12-ish months, there's some nations accidentally sabotaging submerged cables, right? No one wanted to do that, but then accidents can happen, right? There's a lot of accidents during the recent times. So then, when you strategically damage a submerged cables, so you can have a certain nations at their choke points, right? So it's more like geopolitical manipulations. So NATO came up with a plan that, well, submerged cables being targeted. So let's pivot back to space. So we create a backbone, creating a backbone as a space as that backbone, right? So undersea cables are not good enough. So we'll have that as a primary, but we'll have a backup as a satellite. So we're pivoting over there. But when we're shifting the trust to the space, can we actually trust that area? Can that particular domain can be secured, or is it secure, right? So that's the next question. So space ecosystems. The first one, so this has multiple segments. The first segment is space segment, obviously. So space segment is a segment where all the satellite, other space vehicles, satellites are not just the only space segment element, right? So there are a number of other systems, like an International Space Center, for example, right? So that's up there, falling into this segment, and then there are some, ballistical missile systems and things like that falling into that as well. And then obviously you have the satellite space segment, and then you have ground segment, right? So that's where the Earth observation, links there, and then mainly these. There are a number of unmanned systems, like remote systems everywhere on Earth, who's doing this management, right? So someone dial in there remotely, they do their stuff, communicate with the satellite, and then you get pretty pictures into a dashboard, and other commercial usage of that, right? So ground systems are the main points to have communications with the satellite. Now you have space, ground, then there should be a linkage between these two. So then you have link segment. So this link segment, mostly RF, right? So that's the primary communication link between the ground systems and the space assets. Then obviously we have users who open the phone today and like, oh, Google Maps, and magically go, right? So users, people in this segment, we as users, we take these things for granted, right? Because it works, not a problem, right? So like, last night I want to find a rooftop bar. So, go to Google Map, rooftop bars, just like walk in, right? It's like, it's going to happen. So you just follow the instructions, right? So that's the user segment. But for me, the most important segment is the integration layer, right? So that's the segment where everything talks. And cyber lives here, right? So that's the link communications. You have firewalls, you have modems, and all these tech stuff are in the integration layer, right? And you have APIs and things like that as well, right? Yeah, you can hook up into an API and then talk with a satellite, right? So that's how this technology is there today, right? So it's purely nothing. Well, it can looks like rocket science, but then it's simply that simplicity is there. You just use an API to communicate with a satellite, right? So that's the power of the integration layer, which put all these things together. And I can see some of the audience members having eyebrows raised when you're mentioning the integration layer, right? And now, okay. So this was, I took it yesterday actually. I thought this is really meaningful photos. You can see like a new Qantas and then the legacy Qantas. So this is how the space works, right? So we have 60-year-old satellites, right? So when they send up there, they didn't really think about security the way we think about today, right? So they have functional satellites, legacy protocols. At the time, we still do this security through obscurity. I know, we all know it's not going to work, but that's how we do things, right? So in those legacy sort of satellites, the whole idea of security is security through obscurity, right? So we have these near-death satellites, and we also have end-of-life satellites. So end-of-life satellites are satellites which are no longer used by a service provider or the owner, so they just like let it go. Sometimes, they're not necessarily dump them in the graveyard orbit, so they're still in the orbit. So now, as a vendor or the owner, previous owner, I don't really use that satellite, but that doesn't mean an adversary can take over that satellite. Then I might say, oh, they don't have anything usable in there. Well, I might hard-coded keys, which have been used in every single ecosystems of mine. In those satellites, if someone can harvest that, then they should be able to hypothetically use the same key. Or, even better, what they can do is, if they can change the navigation of these satellites, they can create collisions between other devices up there in the orbit, right? So that create cascading effects. Right? And then we get into like a weapons in the space, right? Things like that. But then new space is a coined term in recent years around the commercialization of private sector in the space, right? So we have asteroid mining, we have Earth observations, we have a lot of commercial usage in the space. Well, you have space tourism, right? So things like that comes in. So this is the new space. So new space encourage innovation. Right? So we no longer send billion-dollar satellites. We build cube satellites, very single-purpose sort of a devices, send up there. So that now this space has all this new tech. We call them Internet of Space Things, like that. And this is a satellite. If you look closely over there, what you see? It's a Raspberry Pi W, the cheapest single-board computer you could buy, right? And then that's in a satellite. Or the AUSCERT is supposed to be like an educational satellite, but well, that doesn't mean it stopped the usage, right? So we had like 2-ton satellites before. Now we have couple of 100 grams of satellites because the launch costs are like reducing, so then a lot of people send in these sort of cube satellites up there, right? So these has inherent problems, right? So when you use commercial, not even commercial, it's like open source / commercial tooling to do like defense communications. Right? I'll get into that in a bit, right? So now the main problem we have in the SpaceX is dual use of technologies, right? Because of the cost, many certain classified communication can happen over Starlink, right, or some other commercial providers because of the cost, right? So new space is pretty much driven by innovation and cost, right? So you reduce that cost to entry, you reduce the cost to launch, so then anybody can send satellites up there, right? So that's the whole point there. And now we're going to talk security with engineers. We need to tell them, well, you need to think of security, right, at an architectural level. So embed security, like we say, we try to bring them through the journey. How many of you here have security conversations with developers? Right. Bit hard, right? Okay. Try doing that with engineers. Are very smart people, right? So then these kind of things happen. So we convince engineers that, as it is, things are bad, so you need to embed security. So this is a vulnerability happened in March. So this CryptoLab is part of like NASA Space Link Security Protocol. So like this is not the core protocol. This is the security layer on top of the core protocol. So that has vulnerability, right? So someone identified a remote code execution vulnerability on CryptoLab protocol, so which potentially they used to secure communication between the spacecraft, core file system, and the ground station. We don't want people to have remote code execution on that. Or at worst, we don't need any denial of service conditions, right? And then a couple of days later, the exploits out there, right? So now we're trying to convince engineers that, hey, functionality is just itself bad, we need to secure it, right? So you got the person to implement security on top of it. Now what happened? The security libraries has vulnerabilities, right? So this is the problem with modern day cybersecurity, right? We try to do the right thing, but then there's something happened. So, that void, the whole conversation you had with that particular entity is for lifetime, right? So now it's like nullified. So you have to start over, right? Winning that trust, because security make things worse in this segment, right? So this is evidence. I'm not just making things up, right? So that's that. And then attack surface in the orbit. So we talk about the threat vectors around like satellite itself. So end of life satellites, right? So you don't need to do much around this. So you connect to it and see what you can do with it. And then, so satellites making the process, it's a computer up there in the sky, like I said earlier. So there are a lot of cost, like commercial off-the-shelf tooling out there, right? So the hardware, you just plug and play, right? So you trust in that. So how do you actually verify that trust of those hardwares and softwares put in there? And sometimes you may not be able to patch it directly as well. Well, if the computer is like, in your backyard or under the table, you can, do the patching and restart the thing, right? So this is in a remote locations. You may not necessarily have the luxury of patching regularly. We know we patch very regularly, right? Yeah, whenever the patch release, next hour we patch systems in corporate world, right? Yes. So it's extremely difficult, given the circumstances, to patch these systems, even though we want to patch. But then when you have these commercial off-the-shelf systems, it's difficult for you to patch it unless the vendor release patches and vendor push down the patches, right? So we're doing an interesting case study in a bit, which talks about how these things can go wrong in a really weird way. And then ground stations. Ground station, as I said earlier, majority of these things running on RDP, which is ransomware deployment protocol. Yeah, right. So either TeamViewer, things like that, because that works, right? So I don't have any problem using insecure remote desktop sessions. It works, but the problem is that you need to have some hygienes, because just because things work for you, that doesn't mean someone will not try to gain access to that as well, right? So patching those things. And then communication links. So I put down jamming here because a lot of people in the aviation and aerospace industry talk about jamming. Jamming is an issue for them around based on certain geographies, but then you cannot do much around the jamming. The main problem I see is around like the RF spoofing. There are technologies out there you can fake GPS signaling, right? So imagine there's a warhead coming with a hard-coded locations, right? And then you change the GPS locations over there from a remote, like a radio link sense. I remember back in the days, I used to play a game called Ingress, so which rely on GPS. This is like a predecessor of Pokemon Go. And then there's devices called HackRF, right? So it's a $100 tool. You can pretty much transmit whatever signals you want, right? So GPS works in radios, right? So what if you transmit that, right? So you can change the locations to those people around that area where they use GPS on the phone. So similarly, you can do it in a mass scale. Then a warhead might get the location wrong. Okay, that doesn't sound so good. And communication link itself, so we have a lot of security via obscurity kind of mechanisms, right? So encryption of that link may not be there, or maybe using weak, or maybe they're using just encoding, right? So can someone jack into that communication, right? That create all the sort of cascading problems. So there are a number of threat actors playing that area. So we have commercially motivated cyber criminals, hacktivists want to prove a point. And the biggest player in this domain is the state actors, right? So strategically, they're focusing on other nations' systems. So this is from a satellite intelligence company, right? So they monitor like adversarial device being found in a close proximity, right? So these things can happen, right? So when that happens, what you can do, just sit and watch, or can you take some actions around it, right? It's difficult to take actions when an adversary satellite comes and take over a position of a allied satellite or your satellite, right? So these are problems out there, environment where not many people talks about it because they're not necessarily leaked in to the public domain. So these are not rocket science. These are not classified information. These are just public information. If you don't know where to look, you may not necessarily exposed to it, right? So pretty much everything in this presentation is AUSCERT, right? Open source and available there. And then you have insiders, right? So this is no difference to typical corporate environments or typical organizations, right? The same threats exist. That's what I want to really convey. All these attacks and the threats, they're not necessarily, while there's a unique aspect to it, they're not necessarily super unique to that particular segment, right? So all the threat we face there is generalized into this area as well. And what I want to talk about is the case study of AUSCERT. So AUSCERT is an internet service provider, provide internet via satellite communications. So what's important here is Ukraine forces used AUSCERT to do their battlefield command, right? So Russians did some magic, and on the first day of the invasion, Ukraine lost battlespace command because no internet, as in like they couldn't communicate with their troops in the battlefield, right? So that cost them dearly. So that's one thing, but more importantly, bunch of other people in the Europe couldn't watch their TV. Oh my God, right? So that's because it's a dual-use technology, right? So using commercial internet provider who's streaming videos and stuff like that to do your battle phase command. Well, sure, it's cheap, works, but there's a cost to it, right? And then the whole case study goes like this. So they found, Russians, because this is attributed, I'm not making things up, right? So this happened before the invasion happened. So this is the first day of the invasion, the main attack happened, right? So they already had access to these things. And nation state actors, they don't have magic, they have skilled people with a laser focus, right? So anybody can be a nation state if you have focus, money, and the time, right? So they identify pretty much the communication systems used by the Ukraine military, targeted that, identify AUSCERT. What they did was then just look around, what are the internet accessible systems? So then they found a Earth Gateway centers. So they're part of a, you have one telco provider, and then they need to use bunch of long tail of supply chain service providers to provide their services as well, right? So not everything has that, every organization sovereign itself, right? They're not self-sustainable. They need to use service providers. So one of them had some vulnerabilities. There's a VPN called Fortinet, right? So it's not Fortinet's problem. At the time, patch was there, right? But then they may not necessarily deployed it, right? I don't know exactly. They were exploited as a 0-day or a simple missing patch. So you gain access, the threat actor gain access to their systems and then pretty much pivot from DMZ to the trusted system, which is trusted environment, which is the management environment, right? So they did something, right? So there's a bit of a segregation, but then, when you lost the segregation from the jump host itself, then you end up in the trusted environment, right? So this is just a nutshell. I'm going to go to like a whole attack chain after this, right? So then the threat actor jumped from the DMZ into the management network, and they were being kind of nice. They knew what they're doing. What actually they did was they selected specific beam spot. So beam spot are something like this, right? This is the world, and these were the coverage area, right? They didn't attack the whole thing. They selected modems targeted to a particular geography, right? See how nice they are? Very, very targeted. So then, they selected that particular area, and then they identified the modems of that particular provider was not using firmware, like authentication in firmware updates and things like that. So they use as a malware, like a wiper malware called acid rain. So they put it over there and rebooted the device. So now the firmware is gone. What happened? So modem no longer be able to connect, right? So they not necessarily hack the satellite in a magical way. They just degrade and destroy the communication from the modem to the satellite, right? So now the modem is not working, you can't connect, full stop. After that, you're not getting any services, right? So the tens of thousands of modems being kind of bricked during these attacks, right? And then for BSAT and the KSAT, it took them like so long to bring these systems up, right? But then that damage has been done. Now what I'm going to do is going to do some nerding of what we just discussed, right? I'm not going to get into the super technical details around it, but this is the methodology I'm proposing we could use. We shouldn't, we could use, you can use, right? So what we're doing is, as you can see, cat jumped up earlier, right? So these are MITRE ATT&CK TTPs, right? So what you do is, based on the attack chain, you put them into different phases and then you tag it on MITRE ATT&CK, right? So these are MITRE ATT&CK TTPs of how the attack happened, right? So this is a bit of nerding of what we just discussed earlier at a high level, right? And what we then do is we put them in MITRE ATT&CK. Why MITRE ATT&CK? Well, it's common. Everyone uses it. Many people can understand it. It's very simple, modular. You can pretty much visualize the whole attack chain, right? So this is public information. I copied it for the purpose of this talk. So pretty much this is how, based on the open source intelligence gathering, the VSAT attack happened. Now, so there's a thing, threats are not theoretical, so they follow repeatable patterns. So what I'm proposing is, well, Sun Tzu didn't say that. I said that. So what happened here is, if we can map number of these, space-based threat attacks and things like that on MITRE ATT&CK framework, we're building a heat map of how these, say, I'm just making things up, like say 100 of those space attack happen like this way, right? This is nothing to do with space. This is just a MITRE ATT&CK heat map, right? Just for dummy heat map for the demonstration purposes. So then what you're going to see is, you'll see some of these elements as like more red, more heat, less heat, right? So you can compare. So then there are some unique ones, and then there are commonly used ones, right? So, I don't know about you. From an attacker perspective, I'm a lazy person, We call it, we don't say we're lazy, we say that in engagement, we use the path of least resistance. That's mean like, I'm super lazy. I just did the easiest thing I can do, right? But we coined the term path of least resistance. So I'm truly believer of Pareto principle 80-20, right? You don't need to put like 100% effort to get things done. Just do 20, so then you can be better at the 80% of the people. So what you can do is, then once you identify all these TTPs, you can map this into MITRE defend if you want to further nerd it up. But what you can do is try blocking the attack chain over here, right? So if it is scheduled tasker, you create monitoring around that and then blocking it, right? So then hypothetically, you try to break the chain where they use the most TTPs from, right? So then what you're going to do is you're going to decrease the likelihood of the threat activity within that chain, right? And then this is the moral of the story is this inspired by the space, but then not necessarily it's only applicable in space, right? So you can apply this in your commercial environment. This is simply what we call threat-informed defense, right? So you leverage CTI into it. So building resilience space architecture, so in terms of the architecture-wise, so there's a huge lot of commercial off-the-shelf systems and then tooling being used, and there's a long tail of supply chain. So we need to think about securing that supply chain and then use CTIs as much as possible, get this information from, dark web chatters or, what's going on in the internet or what's going on in the industry, right? And stay updated from a CTI point of view as well as stay updated from a firmware and other patch point of view, right? So some systems may not necessarily easy to patch in this particular domain, but then AUSCERT attack, we didn't talk about unpatched satellite. We talk about unpatched VPN servers. We talk about unpatched modems, right? So that's the key problem, right? And so one of the key points I want to highlight is that the threat of dual-use technology. If you're using military communication in those satellites or in any devices, treat them as that classified level, right? So if it supports both civil and defense sort of functions, expect it to be targeted, right? And then you need to put down more controls to supplement that secure or the defense related or classified sort of communications, right? You can't just treat it as a civilian infrastructure because it's going to be targeted, and then once it's targeted, the consequence is going to be catastrophic, just like the AUSCERT attack, right? And then try avoiding single point of failures. In aerospace and space industry, there are a lot of redundancy built into this, right? So engineering is a beautiful domain where there are not just two, there are three certain redundancies built in certain cases, right? If this fails, this kick in. If that fail, another thing kicks in. And if that fail, we're sure. But then what you can do is try, right? So the redundancy built in. But in cyber, we mostly see single point of failures, right? And then before COVID, we had certain, active and active passive. Some organizations had like, 2 lines, right? Internet lines, where so when I was a network admin, I had 3, ISDN and a few other communication lines. But then, after COVID, we were going down that, work from homes and, why we need to have 2 lines, why we paying organization A that amount and organization B for that amount for internet or whatever that communication media is. How often we use that? Let's kill that. We don't need it. Cost saved, yes, but then now we have a single point of failure where someone did something funny in the telco, then you can't pay for your coffee. That happened a couple of years ago. This is last year, right? So when certain telco providers went down and then the bank infrastructure fell, right? So I was out there and I couldn't pay for the coffee, and then I asked someone else to pay cash. Well, some people carry cash and some people don't. And once that happened, then, build agile incident response capability where you can scale, right? So playbooks and typical incident response stuff that, you uplift your game around it. So then, it's not about focusing on securing the system, you focusing more on building resilience into those systems, right? And then final thoughts, more on, establishing space threat modeling or threat modeling as a standard practice, right? So, normal corporate, think threat modeling. Similarly, for the space environment, take space threat modeling as a thing, right? And then try to embed CTI into the whole life scale. So I call it like, DevSec for spacecraft, because, you need to think of designing, so build into the secure architecture, and then also think about decommissioning the asset, right? How I securely decommission a space asset or any asset in that way. And then collaborative threat sharing. So I know we have a few ISACs, so intelligence sharing organizations working in this space, but then between Five Eyes, NATO, ESA, intelligence sharing established, and then organizations used to subscribe for that thing. Not just subscribe, you need to actively use them in your threat modeling and then update that. And one of my personal favorite, run red-blue teaming on this. maybe, go down the path of purple teaming. I call it atomic purple teaming. Rather than doing a full-blown red teams and full-blown purple teaming, you select a particular vertical on MITRE, and then you test on that particular part, right? So then you're not overwhelming the organization with 200 findings. You're doing bite-sized chunks, right? Which are relevant to that point in time, because the threat intelligence shows that threat actors in this particular vertical were mainly using ABC techniques these days to do ABC attacks in this industry, right? So then you do atomic purple teaming or red teaming on that particular part only. So you actually can focus more on remediation rather than doing cool hacking, right? And there are some ISACs doing tabletops on these scenarios, right? So I find it very useful. And well, finally, the space systems are fundamental to modern day lifestyle, just like Google Maps, right? And then they've also been actively targeted majority of the time because of that dual use of technology. And CTI and resilience must be built into this from architectural level, from start to end, but not in the end try to bolt in security to every project, right? So that's typically the way we do things in corporates, but it's not necessarily the right way of doing things. And then, we must defend the space like we defend the grid, right? So put emphasis into it and get more awareness into that and go from there. So thank you. And I welcome any questions if you have. Yes,
Fantastic. That was a fascinating talk. I didn't even realize that space was a relevant attack vector that we need to be aware of. We do have a couple of questions that have come through on the app. First one that we'll kick off with is, what additional actions can be done to protect satellites from inspector satellites, such as the PAN satellite, which sat closely to Pakistani commercial communication satellite rendering the unable to move due to collision risk?
Well, that's an interesting question, right? So you should probably, I'm a cyber guy in space. I'm not an engineering/military guy doing cyber, right? So that's not necessarily falling into my skill set.
That's okay. We have a few more. Is there satellites equipped to take out or disrupt other satellites that you're aware of?
Yeah.
Yep. And following on that, what defense mechanisms do satellites have for defense in these situations that you're aware of?
Well, so that from a link perspective, if you're talking, then there's a practical usage around quantum linking, right? It's actually a thing. So there are a few researchers in my cohort even doing research around establishing quantum link. So it's creating that more security into that link. So creating complex cryptography built into it could be one way of looking at it.
Fantastic. And last one, with the reliance of Australia on satellites and with everything you have gone through today, if Kessler syndrome were to occur, what does this mean for industries like our banks who do need to apply with our critical infrastructure legislation? And how do you recommend organisations manage the supply chain risk?
Yeah, well, definitely SOCI recognize space as a critical infrastructure, so should be considered, right? But what more important is that awareness in the the space industry around cyber risks, and get cyber on board before you think about these things. But the problem in Australia is that satellite industry itself is really tiny, right? So they're trying to kick off. I think there's a huge amount of government support and intervention required for us to build that industry, and then just to build the industry, then think of, this is wrong, but bolting cyber on top of it, right? So because, if you don't have that particular industry, then we don't have that sovereign capability here. Right. To the broader question, yes, organizations need to think of that around how do we not have a single point of failure, build in redundancy into their channels, especially around.
Yep. So they should be looking at more defense in depth.
Yeah, correct. And I know Kylie had one question.
The Australian government, Department of Defence, use dual use because they can't afford to have their own satellite, right? So they're actively out there using commercial satellites. As someone who's using, satellite technology myself, and I'm sure organisations that people are with in the room also have that, I'm starting to think perhaps we should be asking who the other tenants are, right, in that satellite, because I haven't actually thought through before to go, hey, is Department of Defence in here, or is there anything in there that's NatSec related? Because perhaps I might choose a different satellite, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know what the transparency is like, but do you think that's a good question we should be out there asking?
Absolutely. And then, it comes down to cloud environments, right? If you're using that particular system, who are the other tenants in there? And then, is my information being shared with them? Or you maybe not, but then can they have access to it? How do you isolate these things, right? So, that's a very valid point, right? So dual use of technology is the problem in this particular industry. It's not the problem, it's actually the threat to the certain consumers who are, in this case, defense.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And can everyone join me in a round of applause? Thanks so much, chat.